Alright, so welcome to this lesson where we're going to take a look at the browser and how we can change it from orthographic mode to perspective mode, and also take a look at transform origin so we can help control a little more our actual transformations. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is open up the browser with this file right here, this CSS 3D file.html, and right here you'll be able to see, if I inspect this, you'll be able to see we have a red background color. It's got 100 pixels width and height, and I've rotated this 40 degrees and I've moved it along the x-axis 400 pixels, so we're just moving it further over to the right. Now what I want to do is I'm just going to minimize that and open up Dreamweaver. So now first thing is first, let's take this out of the orthographic mode. We don't want that. It looks very flat and boring at the moment. So we want to change this to perspective mode. How do we do that? Well, you may be thinking I need to apply a CSS property that brings it into perspective mode on the actual element with the rotation and transforms and so forth. You don't. You apply it to the parent element. So in this case, the parent element is the body element. Now normally you wouldn't apply perspective to the body element. You can do if you want to, which is what I'm going to do here. However, what you'd normally do is wrap this in another element, and then you point to that element and you say, okay, I need to put some perspective onto this. And that's the better way to do it, but I'm just going to keep things very, very simple. I'm going to say body. So I'm pointing to its parent element, this div's parent element, and I'm going to say -WebKit. So I'm putting the prefix on here, and I'm working with a WebKit browser. However, you're going to need to put in all the other prefixed versions of this property and also the non-prefixed version of the property. But I'm just going to keep this really nice and simple. So I'm going to say WebKit, then I'm going to say perspective. And then you need to specify a number. So what I'm going to do is say 500, and then you need to put units of measurement in there. So we're going to say pixels. And then I'm just going to close it off like so. So I've said WebKit perspective 500 pixels, and I'm just going to save that now. And let's go ahead and preview this inside the browser. I hit refresh, and now you'll see that we're getting a lot more of a perspective view because we have vanishing points. One edge is further away than the other edge, and therefore the edges are slightly smaller, as you can see by these diagonal lines. Click on the body element right here and take a look at the value that we have. So what is this value actually doing right here? Well, let's change the value to 1 pixel. You can see it's gone very, very long and very, very thin. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase this, and you can see what it's actually doing. Or at least I hope you have an inkling as to what's happening. As you can see, the object is going further and further and further back as this number increases. So what's actually happening is, if we go into Blender, you'll be able to see I have my object just like I do in the browser. I have my element like this. And what's happening is, as that number is increasing, the distance between the object and the view is actually getting larger and larger and larger, that distance. So what that is doing is, of course, now we're in perspective mode, is as we are drawing further back from the object gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Now eventually the effect sort of wears off. I mean, it will still keep going and going and going, but you know, you could type in here a ludicrously large number like 6,000 pixels, or in fact that's 60,000 pixels right there. And as you can see now, it looks like a flat square because we've pulled back that far. We can still see it. However, we can't see any of the angular stuff because we're that far back. We just don't have that clarity. We don't have that detail like we do when we're more up close to it. So the way this effect is actually achieved is when you create a 3D object and when you want it to render as a 3D object, it actually creates a Z-plane. And what a Z-plane is basically, think of it like a rendered scene, or a lot like a movie that you see. You know it's 3D, it looks 3D, however it's rendered on a flat screen. So that's what a plane is, that's why it's called a Z-plane. And what that allows us to do with the perspective value is push it back or with a lesser value, bring it more closer. And of course, when we bring it back or closer, we get the effect more subtle, or if it's in the case of more closer, the effect becomes more apparent. And something very quick just to note, when defining the CSS perspective property for an element, it doesn't affect that element itself, it only affects the child elements. So that's also something very important to remember. And the perspective property only affects 3D transformed elements. So whatever it be, whether it be translate, scale or rotate, it will only affect those elements with those transformations on them. And that's what's basically causing that very different effect that you see right there. And so that's what perspective is doing. It's pushing that plane back or bringing it closer depending on how you set it. So that is called a Z-plane. So that's very, very important that you remember that. And you don't have to worry about, objects behind it and so forth. It's completely invisible and it allows you to select objects behind this object that's rendered on the Z-plane. Also, it doesn't lose any of its property values. It doesn't flatten it. So for example, if you applied these 3D transforms to text or a paragraph element, for example, it would still be text. And that's what's really, really impressive about CSS 3D. So what I want to do now is I want to take the perspective and use that in a transform function. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is open up Dreamweaver, and inside of here what I'm going to do is just comment out this perspective property. And so now what I'm going to do is, with this transform right here, I'm just going to apply the perspective transform function. Now there'll be a problem right here when I add this, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put in here perspective, and then in the brackets I'm going to put the value, which is going to be 500 pixels, just the same, and I'm going to save that, and we're going to preview this in the browser. So let's preview that, and nothing's happened. Why? Well, it matters about the order. Now when you have your transform functions such as rotate, translate and others, they can go in any order you want. However, when it comes to perspective, what you need to do is put that in front of those transform functions, otherwise it won't apply. So I'm going to save that now. We're going to go back into Safari and hit refresh, and there you can see I've applied the perspective to this element specifically using the transform function. So what I can go ahead and do is open up Dreamweaver again, and what I'll do is I'll give this an ID now. So we'll say box1, and then I'm going to copy that, paste it below, and we're going to say box2, and I'm going to change this CSS selector right here to be box1, and I'm going to copy this and paste it below, and we're going to say box2, and then we're going to change the background color to green, and I'm just going to change the perspective right here so we have a more dramatic effect, which is 200 pixels. And then I'm going to save that and open this up in Safari, hit refresh, and there we go. So as you can see, this can be very beneficial. You can create all sorts of shadow effects and all kinds of stuff. Maybe even you want to start making a game or something like that in CSS, which is entirely possible. So there is something that's very, very basic, and if I was to simply comment those out right now, like so, and same for this perspective function, and then I'm also going to bring back this perspective right here that's applied to the body element. As I said, you don't have to apply it to the body element, but however, sometimes it can be useful to apply it to the body element, so then you don't have to keep setting it. So for example, if box 1 and box 2 were the same perspective, why should I have to write that out twice? That's just going to take twice as long. I might as well just set the perspective and forget about it. So it all depends on your circumstances. So I'm just going to go back, hit refresh, and now they're both exactly the same because they are in the same perspective. Alright, so now what I want to do is move on, and I want to take a look at the perspective origin. So what is the perspective origin? Well, many people think that it's somehow tilting or changing the Z plane, but in fact it actually isn't doing that. What it's doing is changing the vanishing point. And so when it's actually changing the vanishing point, it's changing the perspective. We're still in perspective mode, but we're changing our perspective. So take, for example, the image on your screen. You have a cube that is actually a 3D CSS cube, and you have the different perspective origins. And you can see you can be very low down, you can be up high, and so on and so forth. However, you'll notice the default is in the center. So at the moment, we're right in the dead center at the moment. And again, if you take a look over to the right, you'll be able to see the vanishing points and again, moving it around. And again, we'll recap this at the end just so you understand all of the different properties. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is open up Dreamweaver. And what I need to do is put the perspective origin CSS property where I have applied my perspective CSS property, and that's very important. They must go together and they must be on the parent element. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to again put in the WebKit prefix, and I'm going to say perspective hyphen origin, and then you need to supply two values, and this is on the X and the Y value. So the X value, again, you could have any measurement units that you'd like that are compatible with CSS and not degrees and other things like that. So you can have pixels, percentages, and you can also have descriptive positioning as well. So you have left, top, bottom, right, and so on and so forth. So instead of it being center center or 50% by 50%, which is the default, I'm going to change this to say left and top. So now the origin of my view is up to the left and the top of this 3D scene. And so if I save that, go back into Safari, hit refresh, you'll notice the origin is over here for my perspective view. And so from that it's gone, okay, well, you're in the top left now, so I want to now no longer be in the center but render this slightly differently. So we're changing the vanishing points. That's the most important thing. We're changing the vanishing points of each one of those objects. Obviously it's working that out, but we are setting how and where we want to be in this 3D space. We want to set where we are looking, and then from that the computer can say, okay, I now know all of the different vanishing points because of the point where you are at the moment. And again, you can change this to be percentages, so I could say 100% by 100%, so that is the bottom right. And again, don't forget, it always goes X first and then Y, and then I can go back, hit refresh, and now I'm in the bottom right. So you can see how this is affecting our perspective, the origin of the perspective, and therefore it's affecting the different vanishing points of each one of those objects. And again, if you're not sure about this, we're going to be covering it later on and just going over the whole thing, just so you can see it clearly in your mind how this is actually coming together. Alright, so now that we've taken a look at the perspective origin, the next thing I want to do is take a look at the origin of transformations. So what I'm going to do to demonstrate this is I'm going to open up a graphics application, for example Fireworks right here, and I'm going to draw out a rectangle. Now what I'm going to do is transform this rectangle. I'm going to rotate it. So I'm going to grab the transform tool, and what I want to do is rotate this real quick, and you'll notice that we have this little circle right here, and this is the point of origin for the transform itself. So for example, what I can do is move that transform origin point to the top left and then transform it, and as you can see, it's now rotating around that origin point that I have set. And you can also do this inside of CSS as well. So what I'm going to do is open up Dreamweaver, and right here you'll be able to see I have my WebKit transform CSS property. Now you don't want to put the transform origin property inside of a selector that has not got the transform property applied with it. They both go together. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and say WebKit. So I'm going to put the WebKit prefix on here and then say transform-origin. Obviously you would provide the different prefix versions of this CSS property, and also you'd provide the non-prefix version of the CSS property, and also the transform property and the perspective property and the perspective origin property as well, to get as maximum support as possible. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is come out of the 3D space altogether, like so. And also, instead of saying rotate X, I'll just say rotate 40 degrees. So now we're rotating in the 2D space, and with the translate X function that we have right here, I'm just going to delete that out. So now what I'm going to do is set the transform origin of this rotation on box 1. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is set this to 50% by 50%. So what is this going to do? Well, by default, your origin point is in the center, so this is actually not going to change anything because it's automatically in the center. So what I can do is change that origin point. So I could say 0% or 0 pixels by 0 pixels, and what that will do is make the origin point go to the top left hand corner. So I'm just going to go ahead and save that right now, and what I'm going to do is open up Safari and hit refresh. And now you'll be able to see that it's rotated, but it's rotated from this top left hand corner. So what we can go ahead and do is increase the rotation. So if we keep increasing that, you'll be able to see it's rotating around the top left hand corner, like so. And again, we can change this right now, so we can say 100% by 100%, go back into the browser, hit refresh, and now you'll notice we are in the bottom right hand corner. So if I set this to 0 degrees, and then I start rotating, you'll notice we are going from the bottom right hand corner. And there we go. And again, you can use other measurements as well, but I like using percentages because that allows us to move the origin point in proportion to the size of the object, and I don't have to put in any specific measurements. So I like percentages, but again, you don't have to. You could use pixels, you could use EM, or any other measurement units that are acceptable to CSS. So that is how the transform origin works, and of course that does work with the 3D as well, and it works exactly the same way. So I'm just going to go ahead and undo all of those function changes. So now it's time to move on and take a look at the preserve 3D CSS property. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is create a child element of box 1, and I'm just going to create another div with an ID of child EL, and I'm going to save that, and I'm just going to put that selector up here, child EL, and then I'm going to copy these CSS properties right here and paste them in. Alright, so we have a width and a height. I'm going to change the background color to yellow, that way we can see this nice and easy. And I'm going to change the rotation now, so I'm just going to double it and say 80 degrees. Also, I'm going to remove this translate X function right here. So once I've gone ahead and done that, let's just get rid of this transform origin CSS property, and I'm just going to save that now. And I'm going to go back into the browser, hit refresh. So you'll be able to notice we have this little yellow cube right here. But however, this is not looking right. This should be at 80 degrees, and it should be roughly the same size as this red square right here. So why is it not preserving that 3D? Well, that's because we've not told it to. And when you tell it to preserve 3D, your child elements can be transformed independently of the parent. And that's something very important to remember, especially when we're going to be creating sort of whole 3D objects such as the cube and so forth. So this right here needs to have its own 3D transforms irrespective of its parent. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go to the parent element, which is box 1, and what I want to do is on here I want to again use the WebKit prefix in this case, but again you will provide all the other versions as well to get maximum browser support. And inside of there I'm going to say WebKit transform -style, and then I'm going to put comma, and then we need to say preserve -3D. And there we go. Once we've gone ahead and done that, and we can save this out and go into Safari, hit refresh, and now you'll be able to see that we're preserving the 3D. So this child element of box 1, child EL, is now being independently transformed from its parents. It has no relationship with its parent in terms of its own transformation. And so what that allows me to do is then go to box 1, for example, and I can change the rotation. So let's go ahead and increase that rotation right now, and you'll see that they're both rotating together. And this is how we create objects in the 3D space using CSS. Very, very interesting. So what I want to go ahead and do is recap over everything that we've done right here. And we're going to start out with this root level element right here. So with my root level element, the very top level, it doesn't have to be the body element. However, in this case it is. What I've done is I've set the perspective and also the perspective origin. So let's go ahead and move into more of a 3D environment. As you can see, what I'm in is top view, and also I'm in orthographic mode. Now by default, as you know, we go into orthographic mode. So what we've done is we've set the perspective property. So once we do that, immediately it comes out of orthographic mode to perspective mode. Once we've done that, we actually set the value for the perspective. So what is that doing? Well, think of this grid right here as the Z plane, and what we're doing is we're moving closer or we're moving further away by setting that value. Then we have the perspective origin. So what this is helping us to do is sort of move ever so slightly to one side or the other, left or right, top and bottom. So for example, if I go to the view menu, navigation, and we set the perspective origin CSS property to 100% by 100%. So by the looks of things, we are over to the right, but we're sort of on the top side rather than the bottom side. So what I'm going to do is go to view, navigation, and then I'm going to say pan down, and then I'm going to do that again. So I'm going to say view, navigation, and then pan down. And you can go ahead and keep doing that until we're in about the right position, because I can still see slightly the top face of the cube, so I'm just going to say pan down again. And then you can keep doing that and keep panning around. So you could pan over all the way to the left, top, which is 0% by 0%. Then you have the bottom left, which is 0% by 100%. Because don't forget, X comes first, Y comes second. And then again you have all those different options as well. So that is the perspective origin. That's what it's actually doing. It's moving our perspective ever so slightly. So once we've gone ahead and done that, the next thing that we've done is we've actually got the box element. Now this is a parent element of another element that's in the 3D space. Think of this like the cube right here. The cube contains all the faces, so it's a parent to all of those faces. And if we go ahead and just take a look at this now, so I'm just going to move it out a little bit like so. If we actually take a look inside of here, so I'm going to edit this object, we have these different faces that you can see. And so there are 6 faces that make up this cube. But however, the faces are at slightly different angles. Some of them are rotated at 90 degrees, some of them are rotated to go sort of flat, sort of horizontal, but however they're moved right up to the top. Some are right at the bottom, right here, that one at the bottom. Then you have the side faces as well. So you can see that this object is made up of lots of faces. So think of the child elements as the faces, okay? So the parent doesn't necessarily have to have an actual visual representation, which it does in this case, it's the red square. However, it doesn't have to be. It can group loads and loads of faces together to make an object. And that way, what we can do is we can grab the object and then we can, let's say, rotate that on the z-axis or the y-axis or the x-axis. And don't forget, this is all in the top perspective view as it is, so we can rotate on the x-axis like so. So you can do all this crazy kind of stuff, but you'll notice that the faces all have their own transformations, and that's where we use the preserve 3D value for the transform style CSS property. And that way the faces all have their own rotations and everything else, and their 3D is preserved. Even though we're rotating the whole thing, the whole object all together, all of the faces inside of that object are now preserving their 3D and holding exactly where they should be. So they're all staying in relation to where we've placed them. That's the most important thing. And if you're unsure right now about everything that's going on, don't worry about it, because in the next tutorial we'll be actually making a cube in CSS and obviously rotating it and doing all those crazy effects, and again we'll recap this just to show you what is happening. So I hope that this sort of clears up what we're doing right here, and as I said, in the next lesson what we're going to do is actually be making a 3D cube, and then we're going to be animating it inside of the browser. So thanks for watching this lesson, and I hope you can join me in the next lesson.